Welcome to Western Loves, where love stories from the wild American frontier come to life. Let the journey begin. Abandoned by her fiancé, the girl sat huddled on a windy train station bench. The pale white surface of her mannequin was icy cold. Though she lacked eyes, a nose, or a mouth to scream her despair, her smooth shoulders trembled. With only $3.40 in her pocket, her world seemed to have closed in. Suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed. A cowboy with a pale, sculpted body and a flat face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat approached. He had no features, but his deep, husky voice carried a strange warmth. "Don't sit alone, miss." And at that very moment, a new beginning truly unfolded. The offer hung in the suffocating twilight air, suspended over the dusty wooden planks of the Red Willow Depot. Clara stared at the hand extended toward her. It was a sturdy, jointed appendage, cast in the exact same featureless, matte white finish that composed every figure in this brutal frontier. Like everyone else she had ever met, Nathan Cole possessed no eyes, no nose, no mouth, and no ears. His face was a perfectly blank, flat plane of smooth white material. Yet, even without a single facial feature to convey emotion, he projected an undeniable aura of quiet exhaustion and unyielding decency. Clara hesitated, her enormous frame shivering despite the oppressive, lingering heat of the July evening. She was an anomaly even among her own kind. Where society demanded women be cast in delicate, slender proportions, her physical form was a massive, overwhelming structure of heavy, matte white components. She weighed over 350 pounds. Her torso, her hips, her heavy arms, they were vast, imposing shapes that stretched the seams of her dark wool dress to their absolute limits. The rigid corsets she wore, designed to force her immense bulk into a semblance of acceptability, dug viciously into her matte white joints, causing a constant, grinding agony. To the world, her extreme size made her a grotesque spectacle. But Nathan's blank, flat visage remained entirely steady. He did not recoil. He did not tilt his head in that familiar angle of disgusted amusement. The physical act of standing up was a monumental undertaking for Clara. For a woman of her immense size, exhausted by a cross-country train journey and broken by emotional devastation, gravity was a relentless, crushing enemy. She placed her heavy, jointed hands on the edges of the wooden bench. The dry, splintered timber groaned in protest. She pushed downward, her massive joints locking and clicking under the severe strain. It took 3 agonizing attempts to hoist her 350-pound frame upright. Sweat, or the frontier equivalent of exhaustion, seemed to radiate from her smooth, featureless surface. Nathan did not rush her. He did not offer unwanted physical assistance that would only highlight her awkwardness. Instead, he stepped back just enough to give her the vast amount of space she required, moving with the quiet, deliberate patience of a man who understood that sudden movements only frightened a wounded creature. "The wagon is just past the water tower," his voice resonated, a low, gravelly vibration that emanated from his featureless form. "Take all the time you need." Every step Clara took sent a shockwave of dull pain up her heavy legs. The thick dust of the Montana earth swirled around the hems of her heavy skirts. As they passed the shadows of the depot, a few remaining locals, lean, matte white figures leaning against the wooden support beams, turned their flat, blank faces toward her. Though they possessed no eyes, Clara could feel the intense, burning weight of their stares. They were watching the town's newest joke waddle away with a broke, dirt-poor rancher. The most agonizing pain of being a total outcast is rarely the active, vocal hatred of your enemies. It is the profound, echoing indifference of those who consider themselves good, decent people. The cruelest aspect of Clara's ordeal was not the man who abandoned her, but the suffocating silence of the other women on that platform who had watched a sister break down and deliberately chose to look away. When they reached the wagon, a new, terrifying reality dawned on Clara. The wooden bed of the wagon sat high off the ground, suspended on massive iron-rimmed wheels. For a person of normal proportions, climbing aboard required a simple hop. For a woman whose massive, matte white body barely allowed her to lift her knee above a few inches, it was a physical impossibility. She stood before the wooden step, her broad chest heaving, the grinding pain in her joints flaring into a white-hot spike. Shame, hot and acidic, flooded her system. This was the curse of her extreme obesity. Every ordinary object, a chair, a doorway, a carriage, became an insurmountable fortress, specifically designed to remind her that she did not belong in this world. She braced herself for Nathan to sigh in frustration, to realize the sheer, burdensome logistics of transporting a giant, and to leave her there in the dirt. Instead, Nathan turned to the back of his wagon. He reached into the bed and hauled out a heavy, reinforced wooden crate, used for transporting iron horseshoes. He placed it firmly on the dirt, directly below the wagon's boarding step, testing its stability with his heavy boot. "Step here first," he instructed, his voice entirely devoid of judgment. He then moved to the opposite side of the bench, gripping the iron rail to counterbalance the wagon so her immense weight wouldn't tip it entirely. Clara lifted her heavy skirt, placing her wide, matte white foot onto the crate. She grabbed the side rail, her thick fingers gripping the wood until her knuckles would have turned white, had they not already been cast in that uniform, ghostly hue. With a tremendous, agonizing heave, she pulled her massive bulk upward. The suspension springs of the wagon screamed in metallic agony. The entire carriage dipped violently to the right, leaning so drastically under her 350-pound weight that the left wheel briefly lost contact with the dirt. She collapsed onto the wooden bench, her massive form taking up more than two-thirds of the available seating. The wood bowed dangerously beneath her. She sat rigid, shrinking inward as much as her vast dimensions would allow, terrified that her heavy components would accidentally brush against him. Nathan calmly retrieved the wooden crate, tossed it into the back, and climbed up beside her. He possessed a lean, hard-angled matte white frame, and he had to sit on the very edge of the bench to fit beside her sheer volume. He did not complain. He simply flicked the leather reins, and the weary brown horse began to pull them out of Red Willow. The journey north was agonizingly slow. The oppressive heat of the day had baked the earth into a hard, unforgiving crust. In the summer of 1887, the Montana Territory was paralyzed by a drought so severe that meteorological records from Helena indicated less than 2 inches of rainfall over a 4-month period. The Yellowstone River dropped to record lows, and the parched, cracked earth beneath their wagon wheels was a silent testament to a landscape that offered zero forgiveness to the weak. As the wagon lurched and bounced over the rutted trail, every jolt sent a shockwave of pain through Clara's heavy, bruised torso. The tight corsets, attempting to compress her massive matte white form, felt like bands of iron restricting her air. Yet, for the first time since she received Edward Hayes's treacherous letter, her mind began to clear, replaced by a quiet, observing hypervigilance. She studied the man sitting beside her. Nathan Cole's posture was rigid, his broad shoulders squared against the dying light. His clothes were clean but threadbare, the fabric worn thin from years of relentless, grinding labor. She noticed the way his jointed hands held the reins, firm, commanding, but without unnecessary aggression. There was a profound stillness to him, a deliberate pacing that told her this was a man who had survived catastrophic losses by learning to control exactly what he allowed the world to see. "I won't be a burden to you," Clara finally said. Her voice broke the silence, vibrating from the featureless expanse of her face. I am aware of the space I take up. I will only stay until I can earn the $7 for a train ticket back to Cheyenne. I can mend clothes. I can balance ledgers. I am not afraid of labor. Nathan kept his featureless visage pointed straight ahead at the dark silhouette of the mountains. The wagon rocked heavily as a wheel dipped into a dry washout. I didn't ask you to earn your breathing room, Miss Bennet, he replied, his tone low and even. And I don't consider a person a burden just because they require a little more space on a bench. You were wrong today. The town watched it happen and did nothing. I don't abide by that kind of cowardice. The sheer, unvarnished honesty of his words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Her entire life, her extreme obesity had been the only thing people saw. She was the giant seamstress, the heavy burden, the woman who ate too much, took up too much room, and required too much fabric. Her massive, matte white body had always eclipsed her sharp mind and her desperately loyal heart. But this man, sitting on the very edge of a groaning wooden bench, was deliberately choosing to see past the massive shell. Edward Hayes, Clara's voice faltered, the name tasting like ash. He wrote to me for 6 months. He told me he wanted a partner to build a life with. I was honest with him about my proportions. He said he didn't care about city standards. Nathan's grip on the leather reins tightened. A faint, menacing creak emanated from his matte white knuckles. Men like Hayes operate on the assumption that nobody will hold them to their word, he said coldly. He saw an opportunity to acquire a hard worker for the price of a train ticket, and when the reality of it didn't suit his delicate sensibilities, he ran. He's a coward. You survived the worst of him today. They rode in silence for another hour. The punishing heat of the day slowly bled away, replaced by the sharp, arid chill of the high desert night. The sky transformed into an endless canopy of brilliant, diamond-hard stars, unobscured by the soot and smoke of the city Clara had left behind. Eventually, a small cluster of structures emerged from the shadows of the foothills. Nathan's ranch was isolated, built into the side of a dry, sweeping valley. The main cabin was a sturdy, low-slung structure of raw timber, flanked by a leaning barn and a few dilapidated outbuildings. It did not speak of prosperity. It spoke of a stubborn, relentless refusal to surrender to the elements. Nathan pulled the wagon to a halt near the front porch. The horse snorted, exhausted from pulling the immense weight of the carriage. Once again, the daunting task of moving her massive body confronted Clara. Getting down from the high bench was infinitely more dangerous than climbing up. If her heavy joints gave way, her 350-pound frame would crash to the hard earth, risking broken components and further humiliation. Nathan secured the reins. He did not retrieve the wooden crate this time. Instead, he walked around to her side of the wagon and positioned himself directly below her. He looked up, his flat, blank face entirely resolute. "Put your hands on my shoulders," he instructed. Clara froze. "Mr. Cole, I cannot. My weight, I will crush you. I am too heavy." "Miss Bennet," Nathan interrupted, his voice brooking no argument. "I have spent the last 6 years pulling draft horses out of frozen mud pits and hauling half-ton timber beams across this valley by myself. I assure you my frame can hold you. Put your hands on my shoulders." Trembling, Clara reached out. Her vast, heavy hands clamped down on his shoulders. The matte white material beneath her grip was hard as forged iron. She shifted her immense bulk forward, sliding off the edge of the wooden bench. For one terrifying second, she was entirely airborne, her entire massive weight descending in a terrifying plunge. Nathan absorbed the impact with a sharp grunt. His knees bent slightly, his boots grinding into the dirt, but he did not buckle. He held her immense, plunging weight entirely steady, guiding her massive frame safely to the ground. When her feet finally touched the earth, they stood inches apart. The sheer size difference was staggering. She was a towering, wide mountain of heavy matte white parts, and he was a lean, weathered pillar. Yet he had not faltered. He stepped back, giving her space to regain her balance. "The house is open," he said, turning to unhitch the exhausted horse. "Go inside. First door on the left has the lock. I'll bring your bag." Clara walked toward the cabin, her heavy footsteps thudding against the dry ground. She pushed open the heavy wooden door. Inside, the cabin was Spartan, stripped of all unnecessary comforts. A large stone hearth dominated one wall, surrounded by a heavy oak table and two mismatched chairs. It smelled of dry dust, old leather, and profound, echoing loneliness. She found the door he had mentioned. Inside was a small, exceptionally clean room containing a sturdy iron bed, a wash basin, and a small dresser. And on the heavy wooden door, exactly as he had promised, was a brand new heavy iron sliding latch, installed with fresh screws. It was a tangible, undeniable proof of safety. Clara sat on the edge of the iron bed, the mattress groaning loudly under her immense weight. She ran her thick fingers over the smooth, matte white surface of her arms. For the first time in her life, she had been offered a sanctuary where her size was not a sin to be punished, but simply a reality to be accommodated. It is remarkably easy to laugh with the crowd. It requires zero effort to stand on a train platform and mock a person whose physical existence offends your narrow view of the world. But it takes a warrior's heart to step out of the shadows, shoulder the weight of a broken stranger, and stand alone against the brutal judgment of society. Ask yourself right now, as you listen to this, in that stifling, mocking heat, when the entire town decided Clara Bennett was nothing but a joke because of her size, would you have turned your back to protect your own comfortable reputation? Or would you have offered her a wooden crate and a locked door? The heavy, iron-rimmed wheels of the wagon ground violently into the baked, fractured earth of the Montana Trail, leaving the mocking silence of the Red Willow Depot far behind. Every jolt of the carriage sent a devastating shockwave upward through the solid oak bench and directly into Clara Bennett's massive, matte white frame. She sat rigidly on the edge of the seat, her 350-pound body taking up an overwhelming majority of the space. Her heavy, jointed hands, thick, featureless, and cast in the same smooth, ghostly white material as the rest of her, gripped the iron side rail with such terrifying force that the metal creaked in protest. The unforgiving summer of 1887 had turned the landscape into a hostile, superheated kiln. The air was a thick, shimmering distortion of yellow dust and radiating heat that blurred the jagged, violent silhouette of the Elkhorn Mountains in the distance. For Clara, the journey was a grueling physical and psychological torment. Her body was an anomaly, a massive, towering structure of heavy, white components that stretched her dark wool dress to its absolute breaking point. Society demanded that women of her kind be slender, delicate, and quiet. She was none of those things. Her torso was a vast, heavy expanse. Her arms and thighs were immense pillars of matte white material. Beneath the heavy fabric of her dress, punishing canvas corsets reinforced with thick whalebone dug viciously into her waist, attempting the impossible task of compressing her sheer volume into a shape that would not offend the world. With every violent lurch of the wagon, those rigid canvas edges ground against the smooth, matte surface of her torso, threatening to severely damage the structural integrity of her joints. She tried desperately to shrink herself. She pulled her massive shoulders inward, pressing her thick arms tightly against her heavy sides, terrified that the sheer, unavoidable mass of her body would accidentally bump into the man sitting beside her. Nathan Cole drove the wagon with an absolute, terrifying stillness. He was a lean, hard-angled figure, his matte white frame weathered by years of relentless, grinding labor under the brutal western sun. Like Clara and like everyone else in this unforgiving territory, he possessed no eyes, no nose, no mouth, and no ears. His face was a perfectly blank, flat plane of smooth, matte white material. Yet despite the total absence of sensory organs, his posture radiated a hyper-focused, quiet intensity. He sat on the very edge of the wooden bench, giving Clara the vast amount of physical space her heavy body demanded, never once sighing, shifting away in disgust, or making her feel like an invading presence. As the wagon navigated the treacherous, dried-out ravines of Prickly Pear Canyon, Clara's internal monologue spiraled into a vortex of dark, suffocating panic. She waited for the inevitable. She waited for Nathan's blank, featureless face to turn toward her. She waited for him to finally register the staggering, structural burden of transporting a 350-pound giant across 10 miles of dead earth. She expected the wagon to halt. She expected him to point a heavy, jointed finger toward the dust and tell her that her immense weight was breaking his carriage, that his horse could not pull her, and that she was, as Edward Hayes had so clearly decided, simply not worth the sheer logistical effort. But the miles rolled on, and the crushing rejection never came. Instead, the suffocating, ambient oven of the Montana afternoon began to die. In the high desert territory, the transition from day to night was not a gentle fading of light. It was a violent, plunging drop in temperature. As the sun disappeared behind the jagged peaks of the Elkhorns, casting long, menacing shadows across the dry scrub brush, the heat evaporated. It was immediately replaced by a sharp, arid chill that sliced through the dusty air like a straight razor. Clara's heavy wool dress, which had trapped the oppressive heat of the day, now acted as a frozen shroud against her smooth, matte white surface. Her massive frame began to shiver. The heavy, ball-end socket joints of her shoulders and knees trembled, producing a faint, rhythmic clicking sound that she desperately tried to suppress. She clamped her featureless, flat face downward, enduring the freezing wind, determined not to ask this stranger for a single comfort. She was a giant. Society had always dictated that giants did not have the right to feel fragile. The wagon suddenly lurched to a halt. The sudden absence of the grinding wheels amplified the vast, howling silence of the canyon. Clara froze, her massive fingers tightening on the rail. This is it, she thought, the despair rising like bile. He is going to leave me here in the dark. Nathan did not speak. He stood up from the bench, his lean, articulated frame moving with predatory grace, and stepped over the seat into the back of the wagon. He rummaged through a collection of burlap sacks and wooden crates. A moment later, he climbed back into the front seat. In his smooth, white hands, he held a massive, heavy blanket. It was a thick, tightly woven Navajo wool, heavy enough to weigh down a canvas tent in a blizzard. It smelled deeply of dry cedar, wood smoke, and clean, untamed earth. Without asking for permission, and without a single word of dramatic pity, Nathan leaned forward and draped the enormous, heavy blanket over Clara's vast shoulders. He meticulously adjusted the corners, ensuring that the thick wool covered the immense width of her back and tucked securely around her heavy arms, trapping the remaining warmth against her matte white body. The weight of the blanket was a physical shock. It was coarse, heavy, and incredibly warm. Clara sat entirely paralyzed beneath it. His blank, featureless face remained inches from hers for a fraction of a second. There were no eyes to meet, no mouth to smile reassurance, but the absolute, unwavering protection in his physical proximity was louder than any shouted promise. He did not hover. He did not wait for a pathetic display of gratitude. He simply turned his flat visage back toward the dark trail, flicked the leather reins, and the wagon began to move again. Beneath the heavy wool, Clara's trembling slowly ceased. Her matte white hands, hidden under the heavy fabric, balled into tight fists. A profound, overwhelming ache bloomed in the center of her massive chest. It was a terrifying sensation. For 4 years, she had built an impenetrable fortress around her mind, convincing herself that her extreme obesity meant she was unworthy of basic, gentle consideration. Yet here, in the freezing darkness of the frontier, a man whose face she could not read had just offered her the most profound comfort of her life, simply because she was cold. When they finally arrived at the property, the moon was a high, brilliant sliver of silver casting harsh, structural shadows across the earth. The ranch was isolated, built directly into the side of a sloping, dry valley near Red Willow Creek. It was a solitary, low-slung cabin constructed of thick, raw timber, flanked by a leaning barn and a few dilapidated outbuildings. The landscape was desolate, stripped bare by the relentless drought, but the cabin itself stood with a stubborn, heavy permanence. Nathan pulled the exhausted horse to a halt near the front porch. The true test of the evening had arrived. Dismounting the high wooden bench of the wagon was a logistical nightmare for a woman of Clara's 350-pound mass. Gravity, combined with the aching stiffness of her heavy, matte white joints, made the descent incredibly dangerous. If her knees locked or her footing slipped, her immense bulk would crash to the hard, frozen dirt, risking severe structural damage to her joints and bringing absolute, final humiliation upon her. She pushed the heavy wool blanket aside, preparing for the agonizing effort of climbing down unassisted. But Nathan was already there. He had jumped down lightly and walked around to her side of the wagon. He did not pull out a crate this time. Instead, he stood directly beneath the wooden step, his lean, white hands resting on his hips, his blank face tilted upward toward her massive form. He didn't offer a delicate, gentlemanly hand to help her step down. He knew, with absolute pragmatic certainty, that a simple handhold would snap under her extreme weight. "Step down, Miss Bennet." His low, gravelly voice vibrated through the cold air. "I have the center of gravity. I will block your fall." Clara hesitated, her massive chest heaving. "Mr. Cole, if I lose my footing, my mass will crush you against the wheel. Please step aside." "I am not moving," Nathan replied flatly. "I have spent half a decade hauling felled timber across this creek. My frame can withstand the pressure." "Step down." Terrified, Clara shifted her vast bulk to the edge of the bench. She placed her wide, heavy foot onto the narrow iron step. She gripped the side rail and lowered herself. As her center of mass shifted forward, her heavy knee joint locked with a loud, terrifying crack. Her 350-pound body pitched violently forward, plunging toward the hard earth. She did not hit the ground. Nathan stepped directly into the path of her falling mass. He planted his heavy boots into the dirt, braced his lean, matte white shoulders, and caught the immense, descending weight of her torso against his own. The impact was brutal. The air rushed out of his chest with a sharp hiss, and his boots slid backward 2 inches in the dirt, but his structural frame did not buckle. He held her vast, heavy body steady, absorbing the catastrophic momentum with terrifying strength until she found her footing on the solid ground. For a long moment, they stood locked together in the freezing dark. She was a massive, wide mountain of white components. He was a lean, hard-angled pillar of support. He had not flinched. He had not complained about the sheer, crushing weight of her existence. He slowly stepped back, giving her the physical space she needed to recover her dignity. "The cabin is open," he said, turning away to unhitch the horse as if catching a falling giant was simply another mundane chore on the ranch. "Go inside." Out of the wind, Clara walked toward the heavy timber door, her thick footsteps echoing in the quiet valley. She pushed it open and stepped into the absolute pitch-black interior. A moment later, Nathan entered behind her, carrying her worn leather suitcase in one hand and striking a match with the other. He touched the flame to a kerosene lantern on a heavy oak dining table. A warm, golden light flooded the room. The cabin was Spartan, entirely functional and meticulously clean. There were no decorative rugs, no delicate curtains, only a massive stone hearth, heavy iron cookware, and the profound, echoing silence of a place that had housed immense grief. The golden light danced across Nathan's blank, featureless face, casting shifting shadows that gave the illusion of deep, weary expression. He walked past the kitchen area and set her heavy suitcase down next to a thick, solid wood door at the back of the cabin. "This is the spare room," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a heavy iron sliding latch and a handful of long, forged screws. He didn't ask her to wait. He simply walked to the door frame, retrieved a heavy iron driver from a nearby shelf, and began to install the lock on the inside of the door. The sharp, metallic screech of the screws biting into the raw timber filled the quiet cabin. It was the loudest, most aggressive sound she had heard all day, and yet to Clara it was the most beautiful music in the world. He was physically altering the architecture of his own home to ensure she felt completely, undeniably safe from the outside world. When he finished, he tested the heavy iron bolt. It slid into place with a definitive, unyielding clack. He stepped back and turned his flat visage toward her. "The lock holds against brute force," he stated evenly. "There is fresh water in the ceramic pitcher on the dresser. I will light the stove at dawn." He walked over to the kitchen counter, picked up a clean tin cup, and filled it from a heavy iron pump over a dry sink. He carried it back across the room and held it out to her. Clara reached out, her thick, massive fingers brushing against his. The metal of the cup was freezing cold. She took it, pressing the freezing tin against the smooth, hot surface of her featureless face, letting the agonizing heat of the day's humiliation finally drain out of her system. He didn't linger. He didn't demand a conversation. He walked to the stone hearth, turned his back to her, and began arranging kindling for the morning fire. There is a dangerous, romanticized lie that society tells us about rescue. We are taught to believe that salvation comes loudly, riding on a white horse, accompanied by grand declarations of love and violent confrontations. But true sanctuary is rarely loud. Look closely at the architecture of human survival. The most profound, life-altering acts of grace are often entirely silent. They look like a heavy wool blanket draped over freezing shoulders in the dark. They look like a man bracing his own spine to catch a weight the rest of the world refused to carry. They look like a heavy iron lock, installed on the inside of a door, by a stranger who demands absolutely nothing in return. Ask yourself in the quietest, darkest moments of your own life, when your burdens were too heavy for the world to tolerate, who was the person that stood in the dark and simply built you a lock? Morning did not arrive in Red Willow Valley with the gentle, forgiving dew of a normal summer. It arrived like a furnace door being kicked open. By the time the sun crested the jagged, eastern ridge of the Elkhorn Mountains, the raw timber of the cabin roof was already baking, radiating a suffocating, dry heat downward into the small rooms. Clara woke in the spare room. She lay motionless on the sturdy iron bed for a long time, listening to the oppressive, howling wind scraping dry sand against the exterior logs. Every heavy, ball-and-socket joint in her massive frame ached with a dull, persistent throb. The physical effort required just to sit up was a grueling, daily negotiation with gravity for a woman of her immense size. She looked down at her vast, matte white arms, the heavy, featureless folds of her torso, and the wide expanse of her legs. For her entire adult life, her morning routine had been an act of physical violence against her own body. It had involved strapping herself into punishing corsets of thick canvas and rigid whalebone, desperately hauling on the laces with her thick fingers to compress her sheer volume into a shape that society might find marginally less offensive. But this morning, isolated in the sweltering, unforgiving Montana wilderness, Clara made a radical, terrifying decision. She left the corsets at the bottom of her worn leather suitcase. Instead, she draped herself in her loosest, simplest dark cotton dress. Without the rigid bindings digging into her white, smooth joints, her body expanded to its natural, immense proportions. She was a giant, a rolling landscape of soft, heavy material that took up an extraordinary amount of physical space. Taking a deep breath, her lungs expanded fully for the first time in 4 years. She unlocked the heavy iron latch and stepped out into the main room, bracing her heavy shoulders for the inevitable moment when Nathan Cole would see her unconfined bulk and finally express the disgusted regret she was so accustomed to. The main room was empty. The heavy cast-iron stove was unlit. Looking through the dusty glass of the window, she saw Nathan far out in the dead, cracked fields, already working under the punishing glare of the sun. He was swinging a heavy sledgehammer against dry fence posts, his lean, matte white frame moving with a relentless, mechanical rhythm. Clara did not retreat to her room to hide. She was a woman who possessed exactly $3.40. She could not afford the luxury of uselessness. She moved to the kitchen area, her heavy, jointed feet thudding rhythmically against the floorboards. The sheer mass of her 350-pound body made the floor joists groan slightly beneath her, but she ignored it. She found a tin of cheap chicory root, ground it with a heavy iron pestle, and set water to boil over a small fire she meticulously coaxed to life. While the chicory roasted, filling the suffocating cabin with a bitter, earthy aroma, Clara's attention was drawn to a chaotic stack of papers, crumpled receipts, and leather-bound ledgers piled haphazardly on the heavy oak dining table. She pulled out a chair, testing its structural stability before carefully lowering her massive weight onto it. She opened the top ledger. The handwriting inside was sharp, hurried, and panicked. It took her brilliant, mathematically gifted mind exactly 10 minutes to realize that Nathan Cole was an exceptional, hard-working rancher and an utterly incompetent businessman. During the catastrophic drought of 1887, cattle barons virtually monopolized the railway freight lines across the Montana Territory. Records from the Territorial archives show they drove the cost of imported grain and alfalfa up by an astonishing 400% in a single season. Small ranchers who failed to track their feed-to-weight ratios down to the exact penny were systematically bankrupted, their lands swallowed by predatory land companies before autumn even arrived. The difference between survival and starvation was quite literally measured in decimal points. Clara grabbed a nub of black charcoal and a blank sheet of heavy parchment. Her thick, matte white fingers moved with startling agility and blazing speed. She cross-referenced the feed receipts from billings against the livestock counts Nathan had scribbled in the margins. She calculated the burn rate of his remaining capital against the exorbitant, monopolized summer prices of grain. The bleeding was obvious. It was a fatal, gaping wound in the mathematics. Nathan was feeding a herd of 40 cattle in the east pasture with imported grain, entirely unaware that the nutritional yield was generating a net loss. The heat of the stove, combined with the brutal summer temperature, caused a sheen of condensation to form across her smooth, featureless face. But she did not stop. Hours evaporated in a haze of numbers, heat, and absolute structural focus. For the first time in months, Clara forgot about her immense size. She forgot about the mocking crowd at the train station. Her mind was a razor-sharp instrument, cutting effortlessly through the chaos of Nathan's financial ruin. The heavy wooden door creaked violently open just past midday, bringing a blast of superheated air into the cabin. Nathan stepped inside. The dust of the valley clung to his lean, matte white body. He stopped dead in his tracks, his blank, featureless visage turning slowly toward the table. Clara froze. The piece of charcoal snapped in her thick grip. She was sitting there, massive and completely uncorseted, taking up a vast amount of space in his small kitchen, utterly exposed. Her dark dress clung to the heavy, wide folds of her torso. She stopped breathing. She waited for the reprimand. She waited for him to demand she cover herself, to bind her immense bulk, to apologize for being such a massive, imposing spectacle in his home. Nathan did not look at her body. He looked directly at the neatly organized stacks of receipts and the complex, precise columns of calculations she had drawn out on the heavy parchment. "I smelled the coffee from the yard," he said, his gravelly voice entirely devoid of judgment. He walked to the wash basin, pumping a splash of cool water over his smooth, blank face and neck. He grabbed a rough towel and approached the table, standing a respectful distance away to ensure he did not crowd her. "Mr. Cole, I apologize for invading your private records," Clara said, her voice vibrating with intense, nervous tension. "But if you continue to purchase feed from the billing supplier for the East Pasture herd, you will be utterly bankrupt by October. You are losing money on a feed-to-yield ratio that is mathematically unsustainable." Nathan stood very still. The towel hung motionless in his jointed hand. "Losing money. $12.40 a week," Clara stated precisely, tapping her thick finger against the charcoal numbers. "The cattle in the East Pasture require more caloric energy to travel across the dry ravine to the remaining water at Red Willow Creek than the grain actually provides in weight gain. If you move them to the North Ridge, they can graze the drought-resistant scrub brush near the upper spring, and you can cut the grain supplement by 60%. You stop the financial bleeding instantly." Nathan stared at the paper. He didn't ask how she knew. He didn't question her authority or act, insulted that a woman was correcting his ranching operations. He simply looked at the flawless, undeniable, brutal logic of her mathematics. "Nobody ever told me that," he said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "Nobody was looking, Mr. Cole," she replied, her heavy chest rising and falling. "And you have been keeping your supply schedules in your head." A mind burdened with the physical trauma of surviving this drought cannot retain structural accounting. It is a mathematical impossibility. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of the stove and the howling of the hot wind outside. Then Nathan did something extraordinary. He pulled out the chair across from her, sat down, and slid the master ledger toward her. "Show me," he said. They spent the next 3 hours side by side. He didn't flinch when her massive, matte white arm accidentally brushed against the table near him. He treated her intellect with a profound, absolute reverence. In the brutal, unforgiving hierarchy of the Wild West, a woman's value was strictly determined by her physical delicacy and submissiveness. A giant, obese woman was considered entirely worthless. But in this hot, dusty cabin, Nathan Cole looked at Clara Bennett and saw a savior. The next afternoon, Clara experienced a moment that permanently altered the architecture of her heart. She had spent the morning cleaning the cabin, every movement an exhausting, grinding labor for her massive joints in the sweltering heat. When she finally went to sit at the oak table to continue her accounting, she found that the standard wooden chair she had used the day before was gone. In its place sat a newly constructed chair. It was built from thick, raw beams of solid, unyielding oak. The heavy legs were reinforced with thick, forged iron brackets, bolted directly deep into the wood. The seat was entirely custom-built, twice as wide as a normal chair, explicitly and deliberately designed to accommodate her 350-pound frame without pinching, swaying, or threatening to collapse. Nathan walked in from the porch, carrying a heavy iron wrench. The smell of fresh-sawn oak, hot iron and sweat clung to his lean, matte white body. He didn't make a grand announcement. He didn't ask for gratitude. The old chair was bowing, he said simply, setting the wrench on a shelf. Oak and iron hold better. Try it. Let me know if the brackets need tightening. Clara approached the heavy chair. Her thick fingers traced the cold, rough texture of the iron brackets, then the smooth, sanded surface of the wide oak seat. It was the most beautiful, magnificent piece of furniture she had ever seen. She lowered her immense weight onto it. The chair did not groan. It did not sway. It held her massive body with absolute, unyielding security. There is a very specific, profound dignity in being handed exactly what you need without ever having to beg for it, and without being made to feel like a grotesque burden for requiring it. I once watched an old frontier carpenter spend 3 grueling days building a specialized, low-sloping ramp for his aging, crippled hound. He didn't do it out of pity. He did it to restore the creature's dignity, so it could enter the house without having to struggle and fail. Nathan's chair was not an act of charity. It was a physical manifestation of immense, overwhelming respect. Clara sat in the wide, sturdy chair, staring at her blank, matte white hands. A hot tear slipped down her smooth, featureless face, dripping onto the heavy parchment of the ledger. "Thank you," she whispered, the vibration of her voice trembling in the quiet room. "For my whole life, I have been told that I am too much, that I take up too much space, that I am a structural inconvenience to everyone around me." Nathan stopped near the door. He turned his flat, blank face toward her. "The world is full of small, arrogant men who want everything to be tiny so they can feel large, Miss Bennet," he said, his voice dropping to a steady, resonant frequency. "I don't mind a person taking up space, especially when they use that space to carry a mind like yours." He stepped back out into the blistering heat, leaving Clara alone in the quiet cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs with a ferocious, new rhythm. Over the next few weeks, a profound shift occurred within the timber walls of the ranch. The suffocating summer heat continued to rage outside, baking the Montana soil into a cracked, dead wasteland. But inside, a cool, steady rhythm of survival and partnership took root. Clara entirely took over the ranch's finances. She found vendors in neighboring counties who were overcharging Nathan and drafted, severely worded, legally precise letters demanding retroactive refunds. She discovered an old tin of drought-resistant root vegetable seeds in the pantry, and despite the agonizing pain in her heavy joints, painstakingly cultivated a small garden in the shaded soil behind the cabin, hauling heavy iron buckets of water from the creek every evening. Nathan never once commented on her sheer size, except to accommodate it. When they rode the wagon into town to deliver her letters to the postmaster, he always ensured the heavy wooden crate was positioned perfectly for her to climb aboard. He deliberately widened the gap between the kitchen counter and the stove by moving a heavy cabinet, giving her massive body the physical room to move without constantly bumping into sharp corners. He performed these acts of kindness with a quiet, ruthless efficiency. Clara, in turn, began to reclaim the pieces of her soul that the world had systematically ground into dust. The hunched, terrified giant of a woman who had wept on the train platform was rapidly disappearing. When she sat in her custom-built oak chair, drafting financial projections that were saving the ranch from total ruin, her massive shoulders were squared. Her heavy chin was lifted. I firmly believe that the deepest, most enduring form of romance has absolutely nothing to do with physical perfection, stolen glances, or breathless poetry. True, earth-shattering romance is the raw, undeniable validation of a person's mind and spirit, especially when the rest of the world has cruelly dismissed them as worthless. To look at a person whom society has thrown away, and to hand them the heavy iron tools to build an empire, that is love in its purest, most dangerous form. One evening, as the brutal sun finally dipped below the mountains, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple, Nathan sat across from Clara at the table. They were sharing a modest meal of salted beef and the first yield of her root vegetables. "The feed supplier in Billings wrote back," Nathan said, sliding a crumpled telegram across the table. "They agreed to your renegotiated freight rates. We're cutting costs by another 20% this month." Clara wiped her mouth with a cloth, her featureless face turning toward the paper. "They agreed because I cited the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 regarding discriminatory short-haul freight rates," she replied evenly. "They knew they were illegally overcharging, and they knew I had the mathematics to prove it to a federal inspector." Nathan leaned back in his chair. He possessed no eyes, but Clara could feel the intense, focused weight of his gaze pinning her to the spot. "You came to Red Willow with $3 and a suitcase," Nathan said slowly. "And in less than a month, you have saved this ranch from foreclosure, terrified a corporate freight supplier into submission, and fixed a bleeding deficit I didn't even know I had." Clara looked down at her massive, matte white hands. "I am just keeping the ledgers, Mr. Cole. It is what I am good at." "No," Nathan corrected her, his voice dropping to a gravelly, quiet intensity. "You are building a fortress, Miss Bennet. And for the first time in 6 years, I don't feel like I'm fighting a war entirely alone." The silence that followed was not awkward or strained. It was the heavy, comfortable silence of two outcast souls recognizing that they had accidentally stumbled upon something incredibly rare and utterly unbreakable. Clara sat in her reinforced oak chair, her 350-pound frame perfectly supported, and realized a terrifying, exhilarating truth. She was no longer waiting to earn $7 for a train ticket back to a life of misery. She was exactly where she was meant to be. But out there, in the blistering heat of the town, Edward Hayes and his network of corrupt officials were not done. They had heard the whispers that Nathan Cole's failing ranch was suddenly thriving. And men who build empires on the suffering of others do not tolerate resistance. The storm was coming, and this time Clara would not be weeping on a bench when it arrived. August arrived in the Montana Territory not as a new month, but as a continuation of a relentless, atmospheric execution. The drought had bleached the Red Willow Valley into a pale, bone-dry wasteland. The creeks had shrunk to stagnant, muddy trenches, and the air vibrating above the cracked earth was so hot it distorted the horizon into a shimmering mirage. Inside the heavy timber cabin, Clara Bennett sat in her custom-built, reinforced oak chair. The stifling heat caused a perpetual sheen of moisture to glaze over her massive, matte white arms and the heavy, featureless folds of her neck. Without the restrictive, agonizing corsets, her 350-pound frame commanded a vast amount of physical space at the dining table. But she was not idle. Her thick, jointed fingers moved with surgical precision over the ledgers, charting out a long-term financial survival plan for Nathan's cattle. The quiet rhythm of their sanctuary was shattered just past noon. The sound of approaching heavy carriage wheels and multiple galloping horses echoed through the dry canyon. It was not a casual visitor. It was the aggressive, organized sound of authority. Nathan, who had been repairing a leather harness near the open doorway, stood up slowly. His lean, matte white frame tensed, his heavy shoulders squaring as he stepped out onto the porch. Clara stopped writing. A cold, heavy dread pooled in her massive chest, entirely at odds with the superheated air of the cabin. Through the dusty window pane, Clara watched a polished, black carriage come to a halt in the center of the dusty yard, flanked by two armed riders. The man who stepped down from the carriage was impeccably dressed in a tailored, dark broadcloth suit that seemed entirely unaffected by the brutal heat. He possessed the same smooth, faceless matte white visage as everyone else in the territory. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, yet his posture radiated an overwhelming, toxic arrogance. He did not walk. He glided, brushing a speck of invisible dust from his lapel with a pristine, jointed white hand. It was Edward Hayes. Behind him stepped another figure, clutching a thick leather satchel, a man whose rigid, nervous movements identified him immediately as a clerk or a banker. Nathan, Hayes's voice vibrated through the hot air, smooth and dripping with a manufactured, patronizing warmth. A terrible day for a ride, but business waits for no weather. Nathan did not invite them onto the porch. He stood at the top of the wooden steps, a lean, impenetrable fortress blocking the door to the cabin. "You have no business on my land, Hayes. State it from the dirt and leave." Hayes chuckled, a dry, hollow sound vibrating from his blank face. He gestured to the nervous man beside him. "This is Mr. Holloway, the senior loan officer from the Red Willow County Bank. We are here as a courtesy, Nathan. A formal, legal courtesy." Holloway fumbled with the straps of his satchel, withdrawing a thick, heavy sheet of legal parchment bearing a prominent red wax seal. Inside the cabin, Clara's brilliant mind immediately recognized the shape and the seal of the document. The dread in her chest crystallized into absolute, terrifying clarity. She placed her charcoal down. Moving her 350-pound body was always an agonizing labor, but adrenaline flooded her heavy joints. She braced her thick hands against the heavy oak table, the wood groaning loudly as she hoisted her immense bulk upright. Outside, Holloway began to read, his voice trembling slightly under Nathan's terrifying, silent glare. "Mr. Nathan Cole, by order of the Red Willow County Bank, and acting under the stipulations of your 15-year mortgage agreement, this property has been subject to a structural reassessment. Due to severe declining agricultural value, the bank is hereby invoking the accelerated repayment clause. You have exactly 90 days to remit the remaining balance of your mortgage in full, or the property will be seized and sold at public auction." Nathan remained perfectly still, but Clara, watching from the window, saw his matte white fists clench so tightly that the ball-end socket joints of his knuckles threatened to crack. 90 days to pay off a 15-year mortgage. It was a financial death sentence. Nobody in the territory had that kind of liquid capital sitting idle during a catastrophic drought. Declining value, Nathan's voice was a low, dangerous rumble. "My cattle are surviving better than any herd in the valley. The property is structurally sound." "The assessor disagrees," Hayes interrupted smoothly, stepping forward. "And the law is the law. It's a tragedy, Nathan, truly. A man loses his wife, isolates himself in the wilderness, and lets his holdings fall to ruin. I've told the town how much I pity you. In fact, my own land company, Clearwater Holdings, would be willing to purchase this deed from you today for 60 cents on the dollar. It would save you the public humiliation of a foreclosure. Clara had heard enough. She walked to the heavy timber door and pushed it open. When Clara Bennett stepped out onto the porch, the sheer, staggering physical reality of her presence silenced the entire yard. The heavy wooden floorboards groaned ominously beneath her 350-pound mass. She stood beside Nathan, a towering wide mountain of dark cotton and smooth, matte white components. She did not attempt to shrink herself. She did not cross her massive arms to hide her wide torso. She claimed her vast space with terrifying absolute authority. Hayes recoiled. The impeccably dressed, faceless man actually took a physical step backward in the dirt. Even without eyes, his revulsion was palpable in the rigid, disgusted angle of his blank head. "Good Lord," Hayes hissed, his voice losing its smooth veneer. "You actually kept it." The giant from the train station. Clara did not flinch. Her thick, featureless hands gripped the wooden porch rail. "Mr. Hayes," she stated, her voice resonating with cold, crystalline precision. "I see you have traded the business of writing fraudulent matrimonial letters for the business of fraudulent real estate acquisition." Hayes recovered his composure, adjusting his suit jacket, his posture returning to its arrogant slant. "I see you found a host to latch onto, Miss Bennett. The town is buzzing with the scandal of it. They say a massive, desperate woman from Cheyenne slithered into a grieving widower's cabin, using her unique weight to crush his good sense. They say you are draining his remaining resources. Looking at the size of you, I have no doubt his pantry is as empty as his bank account. The cruelty of the insult was designed to break her, to reduce her back to the weeping, helpless giant on the depot bench. But Clara was no longer that woman. She had a custom-built oak chair inside that cabin. She had a man beside her who had braced his own spine to catch her falling weight. Your insults are as mathematically flawed as your legal strategy, Mr. Hayes, Clara said, her voice echoing across the dry yard. She pointed a thick, heavy finger at the document in Holloway's trembling hand. A mortgage acceleration based on declining value requires a formal, independent county assessment. Has an assessor physically inspected this property in the last 30 days? Holloway swallowed hard. The reports were filed in Helena, ma'am. Fictitious reports, Clara countered instantly. Her mind was moving at lightning speed, connecting the disparate ledgers she had organized over the past month. You are manufacturing a crisis. Mr. Hayes's company, Clearwater Holdings, orchestrates a downward reassessment on paper through corrupt county clerks. The bank uses that forged devaluation to trigger the acceleration clause. The rancher cannot pay the massive lump sum in 90 days. The bank forecloses, and Clearwater Holdings buys the land at a fraction of its value at a rigged auction. In the late 1880s, the weaponization of the acceleration clause was a favorite tactic of predatory land syndicates across the American West. Historical records from the Montana Territorial Courts detail how organizations like the notorious Helena Land and Cattle Trust routinely bribed county assessors to artificially devalue homesteads, triggering immediate foreclosures that allowed railroad barons to steal prime agricultural land completely legally. The absolute silence in the yard was deafening. Holloway looked at Hayes in sheer panic. Hayes's blank, matte white face remained directed at Clara, but the smooth, gliding arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a rigid, dangerous stillness. He had expected to deal with a broken, grieving rancher. He had not expected to face a forensic accountant housed within the body of a 350-pound giant. You are a remarkably imaginative woman, considering your limitations, Hayes sneered, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. But imagination does not hold up in court, and neither does the testimony of a woman who the entire town knows is a parasitic scandal. In 90 days, this land belongs to me. If I were you, Nathan, I'd spend that time figuring out how to transport your massive mistake back to whatever city threw her away. Hayes turned sharply, climbing back into his polished carriage. Holloway scrambled in after him. The driver cracked the whip, and the carriage tore out of the yard, leaving a choking cloud of yellow dust in its wake. Clara stood on the porch, her heavy chest heaving. The adrenaline that had fueled her confrontation was slowly receding, leaving behind a cold, crushing reality. She turned to Nathan. He was staring out at the dust cloud, his lean, matte white profile etched against the brutal sun. "Nathan," Clara said, her voice vibrating with a sudden, overwhelming guilt. "He is using me against you." Nathan turned his blank face toward her. "He is trying to steal my land, Clara." "That has nothing to do with you." "It has everything to do with me," she countered, the heavy ball-end socket joints of her hands clenching in distress. "He is weaponizing my size and my presence here. In a town like Red Willow, reputation is currency. By allowing a woman of my extreme physical proportions, a woman society views as a grotesque joke, to live unchaperoned in your cabin, your character is being destroyed. They think I am manipulating you. They think I am a parasite." She looked down at her massive, heavy body, the old shame attempting to claw its way back into her mind. "If you try to fight this foreclosure in front of a county judge while harboring a scandal like me, the judge will not listen to your ledgers. He will listen to the town's disgust. I am a structural and social liability to you. If I leave, you can claim I was just a temporary boarder. You can save your reputation." Nathan did not speak immediately. He looked at the vast, heavy, trembling woman standing beside him. He did not see a liability. He did not see a grotesque giant. "Clara," Nathan said, his voice lowering to a steady, commanding depth. "My reputation in this town is either worth something, or it is worth absolutely nothing. If the truth of who you are, a woman who single-handedly saved my cattle from starvation and uncovered a county-wide banking fraud in 3 weeks, cannot protect my good name, then I do not want the version of my reputation that survives without you." He stepped closer to her, undaunted by her sheer size, placing his lean, white hand gently against her massive, heavy arm. Edward Hayes built his entire scheme on the assumption that the people in his way would feel entirely alone, ashamed, and helpless. Nathan continued, his thumb brushing against her smooth, matte white joint. "He looked at your body and thought you were weak. He was a fool. I am not letting the smartest person I have ever met walk away just because some cowards in town don't know how to look at a masterpiece." Clara's breath hitched. A masterpiece. He had called her a masterpiece. "We are not running," Nathan stated, his blank face turning back toward the cabin door. "We are going back inside to that oak table. You are going to write down every single step of this banking fraud. And then we are going to burn Edward Hayes to the ground with his own paperwork. We all like to believe that we are good, righteous people, until the storm actually arrives to test the depth of our roots. It is easy to support an outcast in the safety of an isolated cabin. But when the entire society aligns against you, when your own reputation, your home, and your financial survival are threatened simply because you choose to stand beside someone the world has deemed unacceptable, the true nature of your courage is revealed. If you had to choose between the comfortable safety of conforming to society's cruel prejudices or risking absolute ruin to defend a brilliant mind trapped in an outcast's body, which path would you truly walk? The final week of August brought a heat so absolute, and punishing that the air above the Red Willow Valley seemed to curdle into a visible, yellowing vapor. The creek had dried to a cracked, muddy trench. The resilient scrub brush on the north ridge had turned brittle as ancient paper. Inside the sweltering cabin, Clara Bennett sat in her heavy, custom-built oak chair. Sweat beaded across the smooth, matte white surface of her expansive face and rolled down the deep, heavy folds of her massive neck. Her 350-pound frame dominated the space around the heavy dining table, her dark, loose cotton dress clinging to the sheer, imposing volume of her torso. She did not stop working. Her thick, jointed fingers, stained black with charcoal dust, flew across the heavy legal parchment. Over the past 3 weeks, Clara had compiled a masterpiece of forensic accounting. She had mapped every fraudulent land transaction orchestrated by Edward Hayes's front company, Clearwater Holdings. She had cross-referenced the manufactured bank reassessments, tracking the exact dates and the recurring, forged notary stamps. She had sealed the master dossier in a thick leather envelope, ready to be sent on the afternoon stagecoach directly to the Territorial Attorney General in Helena, completely bypassing the corrupt local judge. But desperate men do not wait for the law to arrive. The sound did not come from the main road. It came from the blind side of the canyon, a heavy, thunderous drumming of multiple horses galloping hard and fast over the baked earth. Nathan was at the wash basin, scrubbing the dust from his lean, white arms. He froze, his blank face snapping toward the window. He did not hesitate. He moved with a sudden, terrifying fluidity, crossing the room in 3 massive strides. He reached above the stone hearth and pulled down a heavy, lever-action Winchester rifle. The sharp, metallic clack of a cartridge being chambered sliced through the suffocating heat of the cabin. "Stay away from the windows, Clara," Nathan commanded, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that left absolutely no room for debate. He kicked the heavy timber door open and stepped out onto the porch. Clara did not hide in the spare room. Moving her massive body was an agonizing, monumental effort, but adrenaline flooded her heavy, ball-and-socket joints. She gripped the edge of the oak table, hoisting her 350-pound mass upright. The floor joists groaned beneath her sheer weight. She grabbed the heavy leather dossier, clutching it against her vast chest, and moved to stand just behind the doorframe, her back pressed against the hot timber wall. 4 riders tore into the dusty yard, pulling their lathered horses to a violent halt. Edward Hayes was not in a polished carriage this time. He rode a tall black gelding. His tailored broadcloth suit was covered in a layer of filthy yellow dust, and his posture lacked the smooth, gliding arrogance he usually projected. He looked desperate, cornered, and immensely dangerous. Flanking him were 3 heavily armed men. These were not bankers or corrupt clerks. They were hired enforcers, large, brutally shaped matte white mannequins with heavy revolvers strapped to their hips. The leader, a massive brute named Gil Roar, possessed a chipped, heavily scarred white shoulder joint and an aggressive, forward-leaning stance. "The 90 days are not up, Hayes," Nathan's voice echoed across the dry yard, cold and entirely devoid of fear. The barrel of the Winchester rested casually against his hip, angled slightly downward, but his finger was firmly inside the trigger guard. "The timeline has been legally amended, Cole," Hayes spat, his blank face turning toward the porch. The heat and the impending exposure of his fraud had stripped away his polite veneer. "The bank has declared your debt to be in a state of catastrophic default. I hold an emergency writ of immediate seizure from Judge Pruitt. You have 10 minutes to vacate this property, or we will remove you by force." Judge Pruitt has no jurisdiction to issue a seizure writ on a federal homestead claim without a territorial hearing, Nathan countered flatly. "You are trespassing. Turn the horses around." Gilroy spurred his horse a few steps forward, his heavy, jointed hand resting ominously on the butt of his revolver. "You ain't listening, rancher. The paper says this land belongs to Clearwater Holdings as of this morning. We ain't asking. We're telling." Inside the cabin, Clara heard the terrifying escalation. She knew exactly what was happening. Hayes had somehow learned about her dossier. He knew that if that envelope reached Helena, he would spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. He was attempting to physically seize the property and destroy the evidence before the territorial marshals could intervene. She looked at her thick, heavy hands clutching the leather envelope. Society had taught her that her extreme size was a grotesque weakness, a burden that made her helpless. But as she listened to the armed men threatening the only person in the world who had ever looked at her with genuine respect, a sudden, explosive realization ignited within her massive chest. Her size was not a weakness. It was an immovable, undeniable physical force. Clara Bennett stepped out onto the porch. The heavy, dry floorboards screamed under the sudden impact of her 350-pound frame. She did not cower behind Nathan. She stepped directly beside him, placing herself explicitly in the line of fire. She was a towering, wide mountain of dark cotton and solid, matte white structural mass. She took up half the width of the porch, an imposing, colossal presence that demanded absolute attention. The three hired thugs tensed, their featureless faces snapping toward her. Even Hayes's horse backed up a step, spooked by the sudden appearance of the massive figure. "You," Hayes hissed, pointing a trembling, jointed finger at her. "Get back inside, you massive parasite. This is men's business." Clara did not flinch. "I am the chief accountant of this ranch, Mr. Hayes," her voice rang out, clear, resonant, and entirely fearless. "And I demand to see this supposed writ of immediate seizure." Gilroy let out a harsh, scraping laugh. He swung his heavy leg over his saddle and dropped to the dirt, kicking up a cloud of hot dust. He pulled a folded sheet of parchment from his vest. "You want to read it, giant?" "Here." Roar marched toward the porch. He didn't plan to hand it to her. He planned to aggressively shove it into her chest, an act of physical intimidation meant to humiliate her and force her backward. He took the wooden stairs 2 at a time, raising his heavy arm to slam the document against her. Nathan moved faster than the eye could track. He did not raise the rifle. He didn't need to. As Roar's heavy foot hit the top step, Nathan's left hand shot out with terrifying, kinetic violence. His lean, matte white fingers locked around Roar's wrist with the crushing pressure of an iron vise. He twisted his grip sharply downward, utilizing the brutal, grinding leverage he had built from years of wrestling half-ton livestock. The sharp, agonizing crack of Roar's shoulder joint locking under extreme torsion echoed in the hot air. Roar gasped, his knees buckling instantly as Nathan forced him downward onto the porch boards. The parchment fluttered from Roar's paralyzed fingers. Nathan stood over the kneeling thug, his boot planted inches from Roar's face. He had not drawn blood. He had not fired a shot. But he had completely, overwhelmingly neutralized the physical threat in less than 2 seconds. "She asked to see the document," Nathan growled, his blank face looming over the enforcer. "She did not ask you to touch her. Step back to the dirt." Roar scrambled backward down the stairs, clutching his wrenched arm, his featureless face aimed at Nathan in sheer terror. Clara did not gasp or retreat. She felt the massive, radiant heat of Nathan's protective presence beside her, a physical shield that gave her absolute, unconditional safety. She calmly leaned forward, ignoring the groaning of her heavy knees, and picked up the folded parchment from the porch floor. She unfolded it. Her brilliant mind scanned the dense legal text, entirely unfazed by the guns pointed at her home. The silence in the yard was suffocating. The other two thugs looked at Hayes, unsure of how to proceed now that their lead enforcer had been so effortlessly dismantled. Clara looked up. She did not look at Hayes. She looked directly at the three hired enforcers. "Mr. Roar," Clara's voice was remarkably calm, carrying the precise, unyielding tone of a university professor lecturing a room of slow students. "I assume Mr. Hayes is paying you handsomely to facilitate this eviction. Perhaps $20 a man." Roar cradled his arm, refusing to answer. "It is a pity," Clara continued, tapping her thick finger against the heavy parchment, "because executing a forged judicial writ across county lines is a federal felony under the anti-racketeering statutes of the Montana Territory. The penalty is 10 to 15 years in the Territorial Penitentiary at Deer Lodge." "It ain't forged," Hayes shouted, panic finally fracturing his voice. "Judge Pruitt signed it this morning. His seal is right there at the bottom." "Yes, it has Judge Pruitt's signature," Clara acknowledged, turning the document so the men in the yard could see it. "But Judge Pruitt is a county judge. This document attempts to seize a federally registered homestead. To do that, the document must be countersigned and notarized by a bonded territorial clerk." She pointed a heavy, matte white finger at the bottom corner of the page. "The notary stamp here belongs to a man named Aldis Cross," Clara explained, her voice echoing in the dead, hot air. "But Aldis Cross's territorial bond was officially revoked by the Attorney General in Helena last Tuesday, a fact I know because my sworn affidavit detailing his role in your previous land frauds triggered the revocation." Hayes froze. His entire smooth, blank face seemed to drain of its aggressive posture. "Furthermore," Clara pressed the advantage, her massive frame standing like an immovable fortress of logic, "if you examine the embossed seal next to the signature, you will notice it possesses 11 stars. The official seal of Red Willow County was updated 3 years ago to include 13 stars. This seal was pressed from an obsolete, discarded iron stamp that Mr. Hayes likely acquired from a corrupt clerk. This is a crude, desperate forgery." She lowered the paper. "Mr. Hayes is not here to execute a lawful eviction. He is here because he knows I have a dossier containing the absolute proof of his conspiracy inside this cabin. He brought you here to commit armed robbery, assault, and federal forgery, crimes for which you will hang, while he hides behind his corporate immunity." The three enforcers remained perfectly still. In the brutal, pragmatic world of the Wild West, a hired gun was perfectly willing to break a man's jaw for $20. But very few men were willing to hang in a federal gallows for a forged piece of paper. Gil Roar looked at his wrenched, throbbing wrist. He looked at the towering, massive woman who had just dissected a federal crime without blinking. He looked at the terrifyingly calm man holding the Winchester, who had clearly decided that he was willing to die on this porch before he let anyone touch her. Roar spat into the dry dust. He turned his horse around. "I signed on for a bank eviction, Hayes," Roar snarled over his shoulder. "I didn't sign on to swing from a federal rope for a fake stamp. Handle your own mess." Without another word, Roar spurred his horse and rode back down the canyon. After a few seconds of tense hesitation, the other two enforcers holstered their weapons, pulled their reins sharply, and followed him, disappearing into the shimmering heat haze. Edward Hayes was left entirely alone in the center of the dusty yard. The immaculate, polished businessman suddenly looked very small. He looked up at the porch. He saw a man whose integrity was absolute, holding a rifle with unwavering conviction. And beside him, he saw a 350-pound giant, A woman society had deemed a grotesque, worthless joke, holding the very paperwork that would destroy his entire empire. The territorial marshals will receive my dossier on Tuesday, Mr. Hayes, Clara said, her voice quiet, final, and devastating. I suggest you spend the remaining time putting your affairs in order. Do not ever return to this property. Hayes did not say a word. He knew he was completely, utterly defeated. He yanked the reins of his black gelding and rode away, looking over his shoulder one last time at the immovable fortress of Clara Bennett. On the porch, the heavy silence of the canyon returned, broken only by the sound of the dry wind rustling the dead grass. Nathan slowly lowered the Winchester. He engaged the safety with a sharp click and leaned the heavy rifle against the timber wall. He turned toward Clara. Clara stood frozen. The sheer, overwhelming adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was violently crashing. Her massive knees began to tremble, the heavy joints clicking audibly. She felt dizzy, the crushing heat of the sun suddenly pressing down on her vast, dark-clad shoulders. The parchment slipped from her thick fingers, falling to the porch. She swayed, her 350-pound frame beginning to pitch forward. Nathan was there instantly. He did not grab her arms. He stepped in close, wrapping his lean, powerful white arms firmly around her massive, heavy waist, bracing his own core to absorb her staggering weight. He held her upright, his featureless face pressed gently against her heavy shoulder, providing a solid, unyielding pillar of support until the dizziness passed. "You're all right," he murmured, his gravelly voice vibrating warmly against her. "I've got you. You're safe." We are often sold a very cheap, theatrical definition of strength. We are told that true strength is the loudest voice in the room, the fastest gun in the yard, or the willingness to commit spectacular violence to assert dominance. But look at the porch of that isolated cabin. Look at what actual, earth-shattering power looks like. True strength is not about violence. True strength is standing like an unbreakable wall between the monsters of the world and the person you love, giving them the absolute, unconditional safety they need to fight their own battles and win. Nathan Cole did not fire a single bullet to save Clara Bennett. He simply caught the man who tried to strike her, and then stepped back, allowing the brilliant, massive, unstoppable woman he loved to destroy an empire with nothing but her mind. That is what it means to truly protect someone. The brutal, suffocating heat of the August afternoon finally broke just as the sun sank below the jagged silhouette of the Elkhorn Mountains. The transition was swift, the punishing yellow glare giving way to a deep, bruised twilight. The heavy timber logs of the cabin, baked for hours under the relentless sun, began to release their trapped heat, groaning softly in the cooling evening air. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the cabin, a heavy kerosene lamp on the oak dining table cast a warm, flickering golden glow over the room. Clara Bennett sat in her custom-built, reinforced oak chair. The sheer adrenaline of the confrontation on the porch had completely drained from her 350-pound frame, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion in her massive, matte white joints. But her mind was utterly, beautifully quiet. The heavy leather envelope containing the evidence was gone, handed off to a trusted stagecoach driver just an hour before, speeding its way to the Territorial Attorney General in Helena. Edward Hayes's empire was already a corpse. It just hadn't been buried yet. Nathan was at the cast-iron stove. He was carefully warming a simple beef broth, moving with the quiet, deliberate grace that defined his every action. The golden light flickered across his lean, featureless face, highlighting the harsh, weathered angles of his matte white jawline. He brought a heavy ceramic bowl to the table and set it gently in front of her. He didn't offer a grand, theatrical speech about her bravery. He didn't need to. He simply pulled out the standard wooden chair across from her and sat down, leaning his forearms against the scarred oak table. For a long time, the only sound in the cabin was the gentle, rhythmic ticking of a tin clock on the mantel, and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote echoing through the dry canyon. Clara looked down at her massive, thick hands resting on the table. For 24 years, society had told her that her extreme size was a tragic flaw, a grotesque barrier that disqualified her from respect, love, and basic human dignity. She had been sold the lie that she was meant to shrink, to hide, to apologize endlessly for the sheer volume of space she occupied. But sitting in this cabin, supported by a chair built explicitly to hold her immense weight, she realized the lie had finally died. She had stood on that porch, a giant of a woman, and she had used her brilliant mind and her massive, immovable presence to shatter the men who tried to break her. She slowly raised her flat, featureless visage to look at Nathan. He was already looking at her. Even without eyes, the absolute, unwavering intensity of his focus was a physical sensation. He saw every inch of her vast, 350-pound frame, and he did not see a burden. He saw a titan. He saw the woman who had saved his life. Nathan reached across the table. His lean, calloused white fingers gently wrapped around her massive, thick hand. The contrast in their physical proportions was staggering, yet his grip was entirely secure, anchoring her to the present moment. "The territorial marshals will arrest him by Friday," Nathan said, his gravelly voice dropping to a low, resonant murmur in the quiet room. "The bank will drop the foreclosure. The land is safe." Clara swallowed hard, the emotion rising thick and heavy in her chest. "He will try to fight it, Nathan. Men like him always have another maneuver. They have money, and they have connections in Billings." "Let him try," Nathan replied, his thumb brushing slowly against her smooth, matte white knuckles. "He doesn't have a mind like yours to run his ledgers. He is fighting a war he has already lost." He paused, the silence stretching comfortably between them. The cool night breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of dry sage and distant pine. "You don't have to keep counting your $3.40, Clara," Nathan said softly, his featureless face turning slightly toward the flickering lamp. "You don't have to earn your right to breathe the air in this room." A single, hot tear breached the emotional dam Clara had built around her heart. It traced a slow, silent path down her smooth, broad cheek. She didn't wipe it away. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel the desperate, frantic need to hide her vulnerability. "It's your home now," Nathan whispered, the absolute certainty of his words echoing in the still air. "If you'll have it." Clara Bennett, the outcast giant who had arrived at the Red Willow Depot expecting to be thrown away, closed her unseen eyes and let the tears fall freely, nodding her massive, heavy head. But outside the sturdy timber walls, the Montana Territory remained a vast, unforgiving frontier. The drought would eventually break, bringing the brutal, freezing blizzards of winter. The railroad would push further west, bringing new syndicates, new predators, and new, sophisticated threats to the small ranchers struggling to survive. Edward Hayes was defeated, but the world that created him was still out there, circling in the dark. As the kerosene lamp flickered, casting their intertwined shadows against the raw timber walls, one massive and immovable, the other lean and unyielding, a lingering question remained suspended in the cool desert night. They had survived the immediate storm, but as the relentless, violent machinery of the changing West encroached upon their sanctuary, would the unbreakable, quiet love forged between a broken rancher and a brilliant giant be strong enough to withstand the entire world outside their door? We spend our entire lives searching for a place on a map, believing that a specific town, a specific house, or a specific piece of land will finally give us peace. But look at the heavy timber walls of that isolated cabin. Look at the chair built from raw oak and iron. Home isn't a coordinate on a map. Home isn't the deed to a piece of property. Home is simply the person who looks at your most shattered, unacceptable pieces and decides that you are exactly where you belong. Every time I see your comments, our team is reminded how these stories connect us across vast distances, different backgrounds, and open hearts. Where in the world are you listening from today? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you still believe that true love is about protecting each other's minds and spirits against all odds, don't leave just yet. The next story on your screen was crafted exactly for you. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Western Loves for more Wild West love stories.